In this chapter, we're going to talk about preferences and how do we get to our preferences. We get to our preferences by going to the menu bar, clicking on Edit, and scrolling down to Preferences. Here in Preferences, you want to choose General. Now, in General, you will have this interface that comes up, and here we are starting with General. We have color picker, image interpolation and all that, UI font size, user interface font size. All of this, quite frankly, you don't need to change. They are good to go. But however, there are some instances where you like to go in and actually change because you probably don't like the way Adobe set it up for you. One of those for me will be the file handling. Over here, for example, file compatibility. Under the file compatibility, I'm going to leave all these alone and come down to this particular section which says maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. Ask. Every time you try to save a file in Photoshop, it will ask you about this compatibility. Now, by clicking and say always, that means, hey, as before saving layer tips, is always going to ask you, or actually just always save it. Alright, and by always saving it, well, it's not going to bother you anymore. Another thing to look out for would be the performance. If you go into performance, here we have the memory usage, the available RAM on the machine, and the ideal range. Alright, and under here it gives you the option to let Photoshop use X amount of memory, you know, to execute faster. So you can actually drive this lever up and down depending on which way you want to go, and you can tell the software, hey, give Adobe X amount of memory to work with. Underneath here is the scratch disks. Now, what is the scratch disk? The scratch disk is the portion of the hard drive that Photoshop uses to process its files, you know, pretty much like a temp directory. And what happens here is, if you were to ever run out of space on your C drive, which in our case is our scratch disk, well, the machine won't be able to perform any function. It will pretty much crash on you every time you try to open a file, because when it tries to open a temporary directory in which it can create that temporary file to run, it's going to run out of space. This is where you have the ability to say, okay, you know what, no longer should my scratch disk be on the C drive, but rather I want it on the D drive, and this is where you do it. Right, you could basically just click on the D drive and uncheck your C drive, and now your scratch disk will automatically be created here. In other words, your temporary folder that Photoshop is going to use to generate this file would then be created here. For now, I'm just going to leave it at C. I'm happy with the way it is. I have more space there anyway. This is 60 gigs compared to pretty much 5.8 gigs. I'm going to leave it at that. History and cache. Now, the history states. The history state tells me how many history steps I can actually view, and in here I have it set to 20. 20 is sufficient actually, which means I have 20 history steps to go through if I have to make any changes. So if I were to go to my history here, which is actually in this panel, I will have 20 steps to look at that shows me what I've done to this image, and I can go back, you know, 20 levels. So here is fine. Leave everything else as is. Cursor is also fine. Transparency and gamut is fine. Units and rulers, they're fine just as well. Print resolution, you always want to keep at 300, which is cool. Guides and grids, well, this is just giving you the colors. Remember when we did the grids, how every time we pulled down from the top of the ruler, we ended up with a color bar and there was a cyan type color bar? Well, this is where you can change all those things. Plugins, leave as is. Type, alright. Font preview type. Whenever you're previewing a font in Photoshop, it's going to set the size of the font to medium. This is where you can change it to small, large, extra large, huge, and so on and so forth. If I were you, I would just leave this as is. Alright. So in brief, pretty much that's what the preference is all about. And another way to navigate the preference, if you don't want to go through clicking interface and file, is to go right to these buttons over here. Alright, and you could just click next and it'll go to the next one automatically. So there you have it.